This is an interview Amy King did with Annie Finch in 2006, February 2006 in New York City, Tompkins Square Park.
Here with Annie Finch in Tompkins Square Park. All right, Amy King from Meepo Radio, sitting here with Annie Finch in Tompkins Square Park in New York City. Hi, Annie.
Hi, Amy.
Rather than getting into a lot of specifics about your background right away, I wanted to start with something that I read in an interview you did with R.S. Gwynn that's available online. You give a lot of background already in the interview about sort of your education growing up. You had two very literary parents, and you seem to have been involved with a lot of different schools of poetry. One of the things that you say in the interview is that you were, quote, attempting to meld high academic poetics and the performance poetry aesthetic, along with a lot of other things. I guess what I wanted to know is, when you were here in New York, you were involved in these different worlds of poetry. Did you feel compelled to try to align yourself with a particular school of poetry, or were you just picking and choosing, or what was going on with you?
I think I would have loved to be able to align myself with the school of poetry, but I never found one that worked for me. So I would sort of pick and choose bits from one and bits from another. So I'd go to a Nuyorican cafe, and I'd really get off on a particular piece that used a lot of rhythm or had a kind of compelling hypnotic quality to the performance, and then I'd end up at some Columbia University sort of very academic reading, and some of those poems would really grab me, but I never could fully immerse myself in any one thing. So I think it was that I had a very deep sense of what I wanted poetry to do, and I was always looking for that, and I never found it all in one place, but I would find some here and some there. So the city was a great place to be because there were so many different angles that you could approach poetry from.
I read in the interview that you were also giving readings when you were living here at that time, and you had a band that you were reading with.
Yeah. Well, my first book of poetry, actually, I self-published it in 1982. I was working at the Museum of Natural History, and after the museum was closed at night, I would sit there and use this electric typewriter and typed out this book, which was pretty experimentally influenced or performance influenced stuff, and I made a kind of libretto out of it, and it was actually finally the whole thing was published last year by Salt Publishing. So it got published 25 years later. It's called the Encyclopedia of Scotland, and it's really different than what people usually think of as my work, because it was actually written 15 years before my supposedly first book, Eve. But when I wrote that, I was really into the performance thing, and I had a band. It was kind of my brother was in it. He's a musician, and some other people, and they all wore green tights, and they carried banners, and we did like a performance. It was like a ritual kind of thing. It was a little tongue-in-cheek, but it wasn't completely campy. It was kind of ritualized.
So it wasn't a Anne Sexton, I'm so cool. It was you're really into the performance aspect of the poetry itself.
Yeah, exactly. There were multiple voices that would do it. I guess I functioned as much as a director as anything else. Like I would kind of have a sense that this piece could be performed with the blues riff, and this piece might be more jazz, or this would be like these voices kind of in the void. And it was very collaborative, and we would all figure things out together. And then I ended up doing a lot of the voices myself, like singing the best I could, or reciting some of it, chanting some of it. But it was very multiple voiced.
How was it received when you were performing it?
People usually got off on it. I mean, they thought it was pretty cool. It was certainly unique.
Why did you leave New York? When did you leave, and why?
I kind of wound down. I was trying to figure out how to survive as a poet in the world, and I just got to the end of what I was doing. I actually had kind of a psychotic break after a couple of years of living in New York and living on cocktail party food and living in the middle of all the junkies in Tompkins Square Park, which was, then very different than it is now. It just wasn't viable. So I sort of stumbled into the idea that you could do a graduate program in creative writing, which was pretty new then, and applied to University of Houston sort of on a lark. And I got in there, and then I spent about 20 years in other places before I finally relocated back to the Northeast now.
Wow, Texas is a bit of a difference between New York.
Yeah. Texas, then California, then Iowa, then Ohio.
Yeah, where are your degrees from? I know you got an MFA from Houston, and
yeah, actually it was an MA in creative writing from Houston, and then I kind of went through a similar process of what on earth do I do now, and I ended up getting a PhD in English literature at Stanford.
I have another quote from you from your interview with Horace Gwynne. You say, when I teach contemporary poetry, I divide it into 4 tendencies: formalist, oral tradition, performance, mainstream free verse, and experimental. I think this is kind of obvious, but I'll ask you anyway. What tendency do you favor in your own work? Or maybe it's not so obvious.
I've never been asked that. Actually, I think probably a combination of at least 3 of those, maybe 4. I mean, I guess I feel my own work not exactly draws from, but tries to, but is in a place where it feels like it has something in common with each of those. The formalist, obviously, I really do care a lot about the way that form creates a more intense texture within the line. And it just kind of magnifies and intensifies what happens within the poem. I really love that about formalism. There's definitely a performative aspect to a lot of what I do. The repetition used in a more oral way, a more reaching out and creating community way. I guess those would be the 2 strongest influences. And then I think there's something in the experimental in the way I'm always trying to keep language kind of at a distance and stylized in a certain way, and playing with meaning to achieve that, playing with syntax to achieve that. And there's also a real desire that I have for accessibility and for a general audience and for clarity. And I think that's one of the few things that I took away from my master's in creative writing, which was a difficult time for me. But I did learn something about accessibility. So those 2 other the mainstream and the experimental are tendencies that I really value. But I guess the core would be more of the performance and the formalist.
That actually brings me to another quote from. Sorry, this interview is like a bunch of quotes, but you say in the interview, most magazines committed to formalist poetry are overwhelmingly male-dominated, and the kinds of poems women can publish there are still quite limited. At the same time, most magazines committed to women's poetry still limit themselves to free verse. So I have to admit that I've never been drawn to formalist poetry. I mean, I've enjoyed it, and I felt like, I've experimented with it, and I sort of see formalist work as something I've done in workshops, and something that's a tool that's meant to challenge me to, here's a form, see how you can, overcome this or play around with it. But it's never been something I've been drawn to, and I don't know if it's because I'm a woman or because whatever. But I think that I guess I want to know, why are those venues dominated by men, first of all? And it's a 2-parter. Why are the venues dominated by men? And can you help me understand, or can you help me get beyond my limited view of formalists? Lay it on me.
I maybe can even try to answer those both in one answer. I think formalist venues tend to be dominated by men because they tend to be still pretty conservative venues, and socially, politically more conservative. I mean, the Hudson Review or the Yale Review or the New Criterion even. I mean, those are the things you sort of think of when you think of formal poetry being published. And those are obviously, politically more conservative, or I don't know if you want to say regressive, but venues. And I think it's because there's an association of formal poetry with the past and with like the 1950s and this kind of more male-dominated political past that is a stereotype that's hard for people to shake. And that's one reason that editors of more forward-thinking progressive magazines are not as interested. This is really changing, though. I mean, even when I did that interview and said that, that was 5 years ago or whatever, things have changed a lot since then. Like a magazine like Court Green is really open to formalism, and from a much more progressive perspective. And there's a lot more interplay happening now than there used to be. But I think there's still this feeling that form is something that has to do with power structures of the past, which is so totally opposite to my own feeling about it, because I think that comes from a very narrow view of what form is. It's like iambic, pentameter, European traditions, which are actually just the tip of the iceberg where form is concerned, because form is, for me, incredibly liberating, because it goes way back. Before that, it goes back to tribal roots, it goes back to the physical body, it goes back to the earth, it goes back to just general structures of experience that are, rock and roll music is about the beat. I mean, there's just something incredibly revolutionary for me about form and repetition. So for me, the breakthrough point, and I don't know whether if I was going to try to convince you, I'd say, look, there's a book I edited, An Exaltation of Forms, that has a whole lot of different approaches to form in it, including like different meters, different forms from different cultures, the pantoum, the ghazal, blues, hip-hop. I mean, these are all different approaches to kind of the physical body of the poem. And for me, that's really about just tapping into really deep power. And it's a life thing for me, and it's really connected with my spirituality, which is kind of goddess pagan spirituality, and form is just key to that, because it's like
it holds it, but it doesn't confine it.
Yeah,
It carries it.
it can carry an energy force in so many different ways that make people's prejudices about new criticism, 1950s iambic pentameter just seem kind of irrelevant, because there's so many other ways to channel the energy.
And you found that actually in some of the work that you've translated from a while ago?
Well, in my book Eve, I used forms from a lot of other cultures. Like there's a Sumerian accentual form that I used for some poems about the goddess Inanna. There's Celtic forms that are really elaborately interlocking and using rhyme in these really amazing ways. And so, yeah, some of that I've gotten, and most of the translation I've done is from French, from the Renaissance, but I think some of the Greek meters tie into really ancient rituals, and they just sound really different. I mean, when you're bum 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 bum. I mean, that's very different from bum 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 bum. You just, and I find it really hypnotic.
So, how would you reply to a young poet who says, "Oh, I want to do experimental poetry. I don't want to do formalist poetry"? Isn't that sort of a segregation that might not exist, or a stereotype of formalist poetry that you can't be experimental in formalist poetry? How do you respond to just one of your incoming students?
Well, I would just point them towards Joan Metallic or Jackson McClough or Lisa Jarnot, or there's Leanne Brown, I think, is a really good bridge. I mean, there are a lot of people now who are working in experimental stuff, and it's actually bringing them around to form, which makes sense to me, because experimental poetry, unquote, a lot of it was about getting away from content-based representational stuff and getting into the texture of the language as something that has validity as a texture. And that leads easy to form. I mean, if you're playing with language as texture, the more you play with it, the more you revise it, the more you work with it. For me, it just kind of naturally makes patterns. Yeah, it's like when you're sitting on the beach and you're messing around with pebbles, you tend to put them, or a lot of people do, I tend to put them into shapes and patterns and build things out of them. And I think it's the same thing with language. So once you get away from languages like this transparent self-expression through experimental work, you end up
And maybe the two camps aren't so far apart.
I don't think so. I think it's kind of an artificial distinction.
Yeah. What is a formal poem? How does a formal poem differ from, say, I don't know, say a language poetry poem that, engages repetition and maybe even rhyme? Or are they different?
The distinction that I came up with when I was editing the first anthology I edited, A Formal Feeling Comes, I really had to grapple with this question, and it took like 6 months to come up with a definition that I found worked in terms of what to include in that book and what not to include. And the definition I came up with was that a formal poem is structured by repetition as opposed to decorated by repetition. So that the repetition, and I think by structured it means that it has to be predictable in some way, that it actually shapes the poem in a way that's perceptible.
So, Annie, where do you glean the material for your own writing? What traditionally inspires you or motivates you to write?
Sex. I keep a pen by the bed, and and
I hope that's right after, not during.
Actually, sometimes it's during. I don't know if I should say that on the radio, but that's one of the good things about being married for a long time.
So, sex, and what else inspires you?
Maybe you should ask me that again. I don't know what Glenn's going to okay. Sex, nature, that being in nature, and occasions. Like specific occasions. I do like to write poems for rituals, for celebrating certain things. I guess it's all, things that are really elemental. I guess elemental physical qualities of experience. That's what interests me the most, and to some extent, mythology, especially. Feminist spiritual stuff, goddess mythology, because that really gets me on an elemental level as well.
Are there any poets that also inspire you? Poets that you return to, or poets you've, like, say, Emily Dickinson? Or
there are a lot of poets who really inspire me. Dickinson, I've had a kind of a love-hate relationship with. Personally, I totally, of course. Adore her work, but in terms of inspiring me, I have a kind of a struggle. Maybe it's a kind of I don't know what the opposite of Oedipal is for women, but there's definitely something there. Like I've got a poem about Dickinson where I say that in Eve, the poem about Dickinson, a little poem called Tribute, where it says she makes me like a stone, one that the leaves will fall not over but upon. That I have this kind of jockeying relationship with her. So I don't know that I draw on her in that way, but poets who really inspire me, Hart Crane inspires me very much. I think probably Hart Crane almost more than anyone. George Herbert, there's something about his language that I really draw on. Yeats to some extent, especially early Yeats. Sarah Teasdale and Anna St. Vincent Millay, in terms of their themes and the way they use structure. Frost, definitely something about Frost. Odysseus Aletus, I really love. I like Greek poetry quite a bit. Anglo-Saxon poetry. So yeah, there's a lot of poetry that I draw on, and I have actually written poems about poetry and about other poets too. Just sex.
Good. Because that'd be, well, I don't know about the frequency, so I would I was gonna say sporadic, but that might be more reflective of my sex life. Are there are there any contemporary poets that you really like to read these days, or go to, or inspire you?
Oh yeah. Shahid Ali Shahid Ali is a poet I really love, who's now dead, but who inspires me. Oh gosh, there are loads of poets that I like to read. Sonia Sanchez means a lot to me. Marilyn Hacker, Molly Peacock, Lisa Jarnot, Ariel Greenberg. In different ways, for different reasons.
Yeah.
Lots of different poets.
Inspiration. Tell me about it.
I think inspiration, it happens just from being, from existing. And when I'm in certain situations, like sex, or being in nature, or being with people I love, or reading a poem that really moves me, in a way, what they have in common is that they all kind of stop the extra noise, and they allow space for the poem to arise. And a lot of times, the poems that I love best will come, sometimes in reaction to something, but not necessarily about that thing. It's like something just kind of pushes the button or opens the door, and then the poem just comes. So, in a way, it feels like, sometimes the inspiration really is just something that's quietness or emptiness, and that's what the inspiration comes out of. But certain experiences clear the way for that.
Do you, I don't know quite how to ask this, do you think that your poems sometimes come from something spiritual or something beyond you, or transcendent in a way, or?
Yeah, I would use the word immanent rather than transcendent, which is the word I learned from thinking and reading about goddess theology, that it's not something above or outside, but it's something like inside that's inherent. But yeah, I do feel that that especially when poems just come into my head, which they really do, sometimes perfectly finished, that they really are just coming from some spiritual force, which I can think of as the muse, or I sometimes think of as like the goddess, or as as a true self or something like that. But yeah, I think that they do. And then some poems that I work on really, really hard, like that I'll revise and work on for years and years and years, I sometimes feel like I'm trying to take them to that place. And I heard a poet the other day say that the only poems that he really thought were real were the ones that came all by themselves. And, I guess I don't really think that, because even though I totally love and value those poems, I also really love the feeling of working on a poem for 10 years and chipping away at it and reshaping it, and finally realizing that it's finally got to the point where it kind of has its own life. And that seems like a different way of approaching the same spiritual reality. So even if I'm working hard on the poem myself and it hasn't been given to me, I guess I still feel like that's what I'm aiming for, is that kind of same spiritual condition.
So it's not just from the muse or whatever. I mean, you construct, you work at these things too.
Yeah, I like to construct. And that was a big help for me when I realized that I didn't have to be inspired. And that's one of the things that Form did for me, was it helped me find a way into poems where I wasn't just kind of feeling like I had to be the romantic bard waiting for inspiration, which can be very disempowering and kind of weird. But, I also really like the thought that, I want to write a poem about this, and I think I'm going to use this form, and I'm just going to, work at it. And it's frightening to start, because you can feel like it's not going to ever get transcendent, but then when you work on it, it does. And I like that aspect of poetry, that it can be like, like making a pot or weaving a rug, and that, if you do it with the right spirit, you can really create something transcendent out of the actual work.
I have a question for you that I'm going to gently take you to task for something you said in your interview with R.S. Gwynn. Although I think that I'm making it sound very simplified. But this isn't the R.S. Gwynn. This is from an essay you wrote, Coherent Decentering Towards a New Model of the Poetic Self. You wrote, a truism of today's avant-garde poetics is that a fragmentary and disjointed style defining the common mechanisms and necessities of language is the only way to avoid positing a false unified self. This largely unexamined belief is one of the key dividing points between experimental and mainstream poetics. One of the tasks of my poems and criticisms is to explore a third possibility, that the decentered multiple point of view can thrive in the mechanisms of syntactic coherence, arguably the most crucial and uncompromising necessity of language. I have to admit, this passage troubles me just a bit in the sense that I think that there are a lot of more experimental poets writing with syntactic adherence than are not, and I think that they are also getting at this, this getting rid of this false unified self concept. Myself and I don't know, people like Fanny Howe and there are a lot of people I think that are writing that way, that are experimental. So I guess
that's true. To say that it's a truism, and I guess when I said that, I was thinking of, I've probably been having a bad teaching week. I was thinking about, a lot of beginning students who
think they have to just chop everything up.
Yeah, they're like, I'm going to fracture the plane, and I'm going to, defamiliarize through syntax. Yeah, and I think it's too easy to receive that without realizing, how much went into it, and that there are. But the fact that it's a truism doesn't mean that it's the only truism, and I think you're absolutely right, actually.
Yeah. So. Well, what I was going to say next is I'm not really taking you to task, because what I got from the sense of this thing I read was that, that by you, was that, as we mentioned before, the two camps I don't think are so far off. They're not as disparate as we would like to think.
Yeah.
Maybe we're talking more about objectives or goals versus means per se.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing, and that essay was written, and actually, I'm glad you said that. And if I ever have a chance, I would probably try to revise that part, because it doesn't do justice to poets like you. Who, I can see what you mean. I like your work. But I think one thing I was sort of writing that out of this dichotomy between this feeling that the only way to break out of the mainstream free verse lockbox is to break and fracture, and I guess I was trying to posit that it can be done radically through a kind of constructing thing, which I guess. I think in your work you're using syntax, but what's changing is the actual reference, right? So you're using reference in a different way.
Particularly, actually, something I want to ask you about, which is particularly the you and the I, is they're never completely identifiable, even if there is some seeming sense of a coherent you.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's very true. Yeah.
Because you said something else in this essay that I read about just conceiving the self rather than just breaking it down. Something we touched on briefly for a minute was the idea of constructing this self, or conceiving the self. It was a term used, I think. Did I lose you?
You lost me, yeah.
I think I lost myself. So I guess what I was trying to get at was, can you describe how you go about decentering the lyrical self, and even broader, why would one even attempt such a feat?
Well, I think in terms of attempting it, you understand because of what you were just saying. Well, partly because the lyrical self I find it often really boring. It's, what else can you say about the self? And I'm more interested in just kind of getting out of that, just because it's been around for a couple hundred years, and I've read a lot of poems about it that are really good, and I don't know why you want to do it again. Marjorie Perloff is very good on this. I remember when I in graduate school hearing her talk about Wordsworth, and just looking at a couple of contemporary at the time free verse poems, and they were just doing just what Wordsworth had done, but not nearly as well. So it's partly that, but it's also, more importantly, because I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with doing something just because it's been done before. I mean, I don't necessarily think you always have to go do something new all the time, but I just think that it doesn't do justice to reality, and I think that it's politically kind of dangerous, because it's too easy then to feel like nature is not part of you and other people are not part of you, and then it can lead to abuse. So I think it's, for me, it's a spiritual strength and necessity, perhaps, to recognize that we are not just centered in ourselves. And if language can help us do that, but still be the kind of common language we use every day, I think that's important, because, I don't want my world to be all, destroyed and fallen apart. I want a world that's consistent. And I was talking on the Mom Poets list recently. People were talking about this, how being a mother can really change your feeling about the world. And I guess I hadn't thought of it before, but I guess it was around the time that I had children that I really became aware how important it was to me to have an aesthetic, a poetics that made room for things to be healthy and to thrive and to be more or less safe. But that doesn't mean being stuck inside this boredom and power structure of the individual self, and everything else just becomes an object. So, I want to have a sort of vibrancy that's sustainable and healthy. And I guess that, to me, poetically, this seems the way to try to do that. So the way I go about it, a lot of it is through, for me, form, especially meter, really can be kind of a magic tool to make things unfamiliar and strange and special, at the same time that they're acknowledged as real and safe. So I love that about it. So that's one tool that I use. I'm not sure it'll always be the only tool, though. Sometimes, I still sometimes do write in free verse, and I think, it's just whatever will kind of create that unfamiliarity within the poem. It can be syntax, it can be form or repetition that just makes words seem unfamiliar. It can be meter that pushes them against each other and makes you realize how strange they sound. It can be, just the connotations of words. So those are all things that I use to try to create that feeling.
I think that's important what you just said about this idea of safety and as writing as a mother, or from a mother's perspective or whatever, in the sense that, I'm going to repeat what you said basically, but just that, these tools allow for a sense of safety and accessibility, but you're still able to make things, to be cliche, new or strange or unfamiliar without risking ostracizing or putting your reader off. Right?
Yeah.
That's what you were getting at.
That they're real excitement, but within an acceptance of what reality is. And, that's a challenge for anybody just living in the world.
Yeah.
But, I think it's something that a good poem can really teach. And it does it not so much necessarily through what it says, but just how it makes the language exciting, but still, it's still our language. And personally, I love that it is our language, and that it uses a sentence, that anyone would recognize it as a sentence, and it can still create that. That's an amazing achievement, I think, when a poem can do that.
The basic unit of sentence. Even Stein talks about that, right?
Yeah. She really respected grammar.
Okay.
But on the other hand, I do love poems sometimes that don't do that at all. Like Rosemary Waldrop, I love her poetry.
Yeah.
And, she's messing around with it totally. Some of the poems I love the best. So, it's not like there's any one way that's a formula. I can just say what happens to have worked for me so far.
What are some of the challenges you face as a translator of formal verse that those translating free verse don't typically encounter?
Oh, wow. Well, I just have put the finishing touches on the galleys of this complete poems of Louise Labbé, and she wrote in the Renaissance, and I copied her sonnet forms exactly, and the rhymes and exact rhyme schemes, which sometimes she would have like 8 words rhyming on one sound. So that was really a challenge. I mean,
yeah, the easier way would be just to translate without rhyming, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And in fact, she's been translated into free verse a few times, and she'd been translated into a Shakespearean sonnet where you only have to have 2 words rhyming. But nobody had ever even translated her into an Italian sonnet with 4 words rhyming, let alone copied the fact that she once had 8 words rhyme. So, yeah, I mean, it was the hardest way to do it, I think.
I was just going to ask you, how has translating in general informed or affected your own work, your own writing?
Yeah, I've learned a lot about structure, certainly about rhyme, and then it just being, it's almost like you add another, I don't know, it's almost like adding another ghost of a person to fill your whole body, and you're never the same afterwards. I mean, it's like being inhabited by a spirit. So I feel like I always have Louise Labbé with me now. And I think it made me more free to write about erotic things, because that's her big subject, is passion. So I used to be more inhibited writing like explicitly about passion or sex, and now I am not so inhibited. And then the rhyme, especially with her. Then from like the Anglo-Saxon poetry that I've translated, I think it just gave me more of a sense of groundedness in the English language.
And Louise has freed you.
Yeah.
I know you've published several books of poetry, Eve and Calendars and the Encyclopedia of Scotland. For new readers of Annie Finch, here's a 2-parter for you again. Are there any poems off the top of your head that represent a standard kind of poem you lean towards? And 2, are there any standout poems in your books that you're especially fond of or proud of that someone might look for as well? Or maybe they're not even separate. Maybe they're both representational of Annie Finch.
Huh. Well, I think there are some of the small lyrics that are really given to me that just kind of come into my head, like the first poem in Calendars, Landing Underwater, I See Roots. Very small poem. It's a shopping cart with all kinds of interesting stuff in it. I guess that's one of the poems. One of the kind of poems that I have are these, like an 8-line poem that has like a ballad meter to it and is a little bit enigmatic, but also kind of clear and has a natural and spiritual focus. So like Landing Underwater, I can recite that one for you. I don't know if you do that.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. All the things we hide in water, hoping we won't see them go. Forests growing underwater press against the ones we know. And they might have gone on growing, and they might now breathe above everything I think of sowing, everything I try to love. So that's sowing, S-O-W-I-N-G. All the things we hide in water, hoping we won't see them go. Forests growing underwater press against the ones we know. And they might have gone on growing, and they might now breathe above everything I think of sowing, everything I try to love. So I guess, that feels like my voice in a certain way. And then there are other poems that are a lot more complex, like some of the ones that examples of this that might be representative are Letter to Emily Dickinson, which is, it's much more woven, more complex, but it also has a kind of a directness to it. Then there are some that are in multiple voices, especially in calendars. There's the title poem of Calendars and a poem called Over Dark Arches. A lot of the poems about giving birth, they'll have like different voices kind of playing against each other, so they're more like performance poems. And I am interested in writing narrative poetry and dramatic poetry and lyric poetry. So those will look really different from each other. Like The Landing Underwater is just a little lyric, and then the ones with different voices would be dramatic. And then there are the narratives. Catching the Mermother is one that a lot of people have written about or talked about, because it does tell a sort of mythological story about catching this creature.
What is the mermaid?
It's a mermother. It's not exactly. It's a mermaid who was a mother, which is a paradox, and it's about killing her baby. I mean, some people have seen it as a poem about abortion, and some people see it as a poem about mother-daughter relationships. I think mother-daughter imagery is something pretty common. In my next book, there's going to be a poem called Mother, which is actually online in a very early version. And that's definitely one of the themes I'm interested in.
What are some of the other themes?
Well, nature, especially like the Wiccan attitude towards nature, the Wheel of the Year. I've got poems for the equinoxes and the solstices, and the Wiccan holidays in Bulk and Samhain. And like Watching the Whale is a poem that I think is pretty significant about it's about going on a whale, just seeing a whale, but the whale becomes like a symbol, I guess, of kind of goddess power or of something like that.
It's different from the other whale we've learned about. The white whale.
Oh yeah. That's so interesting, because I had such a difficult relationship with that book, with Moby Dick. It was like when I was starting to teach, I knew the one thing I didn't want to do was ever have to teach Moby Dick. I had this, and I didn't. It's funny, I never realized before that I ended up writing a poem about a whale. My whale is a female whale.
You're not trying to kill your whale, are you?
No, opposite. Yeah. So yeah, I guess Earth spirituality is a big theme. Mother daughters is a big theme. Sex and childbirth is a big theme. And then there are some political poems. There's a Gulf War and Child is a pretty significant. It's kind of unusual. I mean, in that it's my most explicitly political poem. It's actually about the Gulf War, and usually my poems really don't reference specific events, or so far they haven't. But I actually think it's very typical in another way.
So now you're finding it more important to include these political things?
I think so. The poem I'm working on now is, there's a website, I can't remember the name of it right now, but there's a website that has poems about all the Congress people. And so they asked me to do one for that website about my local congressman. And I'm working on this ode to him. And it's going to be like a really serious public political poem. And I've been going back and reading all these 18th century odes to try to think about ways to reference like political events and do it in a way that's going to be relevant.
Yeah.
So I think I've been thinking for a while that I might for probably 10 years I wanted to find a way to get more explicit political stuff into my work. And I think this poem, when I finish this ode, it's going to be sort of an experiment to see whether that's something I can do now.
I wrote a poem for that website too, on my Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney.
Oh,
Yeah.
Cynthia McKinney. Oh, I've seen that. I liked that
Oh,
one.
good.
Yeah, it's a good one. Yeah, I remember. You had a real challenge.
She's great. She's amazing, that woman. She's doing all sorts of stuff. She's stand out.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to see yours too. When is it coming out? Do you know? Or you're not? You haven't finished writing it?
No, I'm taking a long time on it.
Yeah.
I've been doing the research for like 3 months, and yeah, it'll probably be another 6 months before it's
Wow.
done. So
That's something to watch out for. Okay, just a few more questions here. When did you start the Women's Poetry Listserv?
December '97.
And so it's been for a while now, like almost 10 years. Yeah. What was the impetus for starting that listserv?
Well, I was on SUNY Buffalo list.
Speaking of politics.
Right. I was on the SUNY Buffalo list, and I was on another list at the time that was there called CAPL, Contemporary American Poetry List. And they were really the only two serious poetry listservs, and both of them just became intolerable to me because they would deteriorate into these duels between two men. I mean, every single discussion would turn into a really nasty fight, and other people weren't posting, and women routinely just didn't post, or if they did, they'd be kind of catering to the men, and it just wasn't a good scene. So
I have some memory of that.
yeah. So one day I just kind of woke up and I thought, I'm really sick of this. I wanted to start my own, so I just did. I had no idea.
It's pretty popular. I mean, you have a good number of
Yeah,
poets on there.
almost 600 people now. And not all poets, which I kind of like, but mostly they are poets.
And gender lines, there are men involved too. I mean, I know I see them in posts, but respectfully so.
Yeah.
They don't dwindle down into these arguments.
Yeah. Men do post, but they don't act that way. I think it was Gabe Gutting who actually said about 4 or 5 years into the list, he posted something like, wow, the climate on this list is really different than any other list I've ever been on. It's so civilized, and it's so relaxed. I wonder why. And all the women on the list were like laughing.
Funny. I remember Gabe being involved in those Poetic list discussions that were pretty harsh. Okay. Let me see. I already asked you that. All right. I guess, can you tell me a little bit about I think that we've probably touched on some of the things you're going to be doing, but can you tell me a little bit about the workshop that you're going to be conducting on the Me Poesias Poetry at Sea Cruise?
It's May 27th to June 3rd. It's going to be a workshop called The Body of the Poem, and it's going to draw on my experience writing in form and teaching with form to help participants not to force their poems into any particular predetermined form, but to read their poems with an ear to what's already happening physically in the poem in terms of rhythm. And so it's really going to be about putting your ear very close to the pulse of your poem, hearing what's going on, learning some basic vocabulary to kind of define what's happening, and then to feel like if certain parts of the poem are in certain rhythms, then to feel what's the mood, what's the feeling, what's the power behind those different rhythms, and then which ones do you want to work with, how do you want to shape them. So it's kind of going inward and then stepping back and looking at the poem and strengthening the poem, really strengthening it by picking out the pulses that are there and then working with them to find structures.
Sounds interesting. Looks like it's going to be a fun cruise.
Yeah, I think it should be. I'm looking forward to it.
Interesting concept too. Poetry at sea. Might as well be. I mean,
it is at sea a little bit nowadays, isn't it?
How has your transition as the director of the MFA program at Stonecoast been going, and how are you finding it, and balancing your writing as well as running this program?
It's a really nice change from teaching full-time. I still teach a little bit. I can sort of teach as much as I want to or need to, but I'm finding that the quality of my writing is getting more resonant or deeper for me because I don't have so many voices of student poems in my head, so I really have more silence and more space for my own poetry, which is a nice change after teaching for 12 years. And the transition has been a lot of fun, challenging. I've discovered all these strengths and skills I didn't know I had, and I've really enjoyed it. It's a fun program. I inherited a lot of great stuff, wonderful faculty, and a really beautiful facility. So it's right on the coast of Maine. So I've been able to work with that, and then I've been really working very hard getting things in shape academically and working on the curriculum and just standardizing a lot of stuff that hadn't been figured out before because the program was new. So I put a lot into it, and I think I've got a very good structure in place, and I'm looking forward to, being able to put my writing more into the mix now, because the first year or so has been very demanding in terms of the program. But I think it's going to work out great.
Sounds like a good gig.
Yeah, it is. It's really special, and it's one that I never would have anticipated that I was ever going to do, but it's working out great.
Well, it's been very nice talking to you, Annie, and I'm glad you made it to New York. You'll have to let me know when you come back again.
Thank you. I will. It's really fun talking with you.